Hi there. I'm Marilyn, CEO and founder of Cosmic Centaurs, and we are a leadership and organizational development consultancy. Today, you're joining me for the 5th online event of this year's edition of the Cosmic Conference. This event is part of our 2-month-long conference all about leadership polarities, the Cosmic Dance, Mastering Dualities in Leadership, which comes to its last day today. There's this session with me, and later at 6 p.m., there'll be a session with Joe Santos about, believe it or not, the limitations of polarities. We've been running the Cosmic Conference for 5 years, and one of our principles is that we love to share what we learn with the world, and we love to impact as many people as possible by doing this for free online and to provide this context and this knowledge to all. And every year we choose a theme that we think resonates with the leaders that we work with. This year, we've chosen what we think is a bit of a timeless theme to help leaders master a key skill that is essential for navigating in a complex world, the topic of polarities. All leaders, whether they've been in the C-suite for decades or are first-time managers, are constantly navigating these seemingly opposing demands. Being in the present, imagining the future, engaging your people, demanding performance. Building a profitable business, investing in growth, and so many others. Great leaders know that their superpower comes from developing their range, from having the ability to dance along the spectrum. That is what drives sustainable organizational growth. They go from either or mindsets to both and mindsets, and this allows them to thrive in a complex world. In earlier sessions, whether they were online or in person, we dove deep into polarities, exploring how we as individual members experience them, how we experience them when we're part of leadership team, how we can manage our own tensions, and how we can do it within the context of our teams. But now we're going to take this concept and scale it. During this session, I'll be exploring how dualities apply to the level of the organization. I'll be speaking for the next 20 or 30 minutes, but if you'd like to ask me questions, please drop them in the comments and I'll get to them at the end of the session. In organizations, dualities work pretty much the same way as they do in other levels. You know, these tensions that I mentioned earlier, present, future, growth, profit, exploration, exploitation, they are also attributes of the organizations that we build or work for. The question that I want to help us answer today is how can we build organizational capabilities that make our teams, our companies more able to sustain these tensions beyond us as individuals? You know, great leadership is about building organizations that can outlast us, that continue to thrive, whether or not we are there, whether we are there to steer them or not, and building these organizations that can really hold these tensions is how we can build organizations that thrive and that can adapt to any future. And organizations that can adapt to future are companies that we, qualify as having organizational resilience. If you go to the bottom of this slide and focus on the organizational resilience piece, it's the ability to dynamically reinvent business models and strategies as circumstances and contexts change. In short, resilient companies can cope with any future. And we all know that in our region, but also globally, we've all been in a context of high uncertainty and complexity, from the US elections to the instability in the Levant, to the GCC that is continuing to emerge, especially in countries like Saudi Arabia, where the environment is changing at crazy speed. So no matter where you are today on the globe, you are experiencing these environments that are changing circumstances and context, and you have to think about how you can build a company that can cope with these changes. Today, I hope to leave you with a view that the concept of polarities isn't just about personal growth, it's also about creating resilient systems without it being dependent on a single person, but rather having that resilience woven into the fabric of your organization. Let's talk a little bit about the context in which we all operate today. We spoke about it being complex, right? And complexity means that we're in an environment where it's not easy to predict what is going to happen next, right? We're in an environment where our best practices, expert advice fail, because as things emerge and we are learning about them, we can't simply refer to how they've been dealt with in the past. Instead, in order to cope with these complex environments, we need to build organizations that can sense the change, organizations that are able to understand almost instinctively what is happening to the world around us, but then have the capacity, the strategy, the structure, the culture to develop emerging practices, services, products in response to the changing world. The truth is that to lead in a complex world, you have to be a holistic thinker. And what that means is that you have to understand that your organization is a system and part of a bigger system yet. Every part is interconnected, influencing one another. It's a web of people, behaviors, systems, processes, and of course, your culture and the surrounding culture. And holistic leaders understand that their role is to develop and influence the entire system, ensuring that it functions as a cohesive whole. They also understand that changing one element affects the entire system. In order to help leaders think through this, we developed a framework called the Omnichannel Organization. It's a holistic view of the organizations and the layers that need to work in alignment so that your organization can thrive. In a complex environment, things like processes and systems, they're not the first thing we refer to because we're not talking about best practices and expert advice. And if you want to spend some time thinking about how polarities apply to you as an individual, I will invite you to go back to all of the other sessions that we've had as part of the conference. And you may also want to apply the polarity map, use it as a tool to identify your own polarities and work on them. Where I'm going to focus my discussion today is on strategy, structure, and culture, because those are the elements that need to respond to a changing world first. That's not to say that people, process, systems don't matter. It's just to say that they are the first way through which we represent our adaptation to change. And in order to do that, and rather than just lay on some frameworks, although I will, I very much like to say that this session is my impersonification of an MBA teacher. So there will be lots of frameworks because I love frameworks. But before I do that and just go through the frameworks, I want to do it through the lens of one of my favorite case studies, which isn't as spoken of as one would think, considering the massive, success that Fujifilm ended up experiencing. We're going to do it through the story of Fujifilm and Kodak and a bit of a comparison between those two organizations and how they dealt with what we can honestly say was a very difficult shift in their environment, and how they leveraged these layers of strategy, structure, and culture. Well, one of them did, at the very least, in order to be able to navigate those turbulent waters. Let's begin our story. In the year 2000, the number of photos preserved on film peaked at 85 billion photos. And two companies dominated the market, Fujifilm and Kodak. Only 7 years later, 94% of the world's information, including photos, was stored digitally, and the demand for photographic film was nowhere to be found. And as the pendulum swung from analog to digital, only one of the two giants made it alive, and this is its story. Now, let's begin with the stories of both companies. On the one hand, you have Kodak, founded by George Eastman in the late 19th century, with this purpose of making photography accessible to everybody. This was a company that was founded on innovation. In 1888, they developed their first handheld camera and flexible roll film. That simplified photography to a degree we can only imagine these days. They developed an affordable camera called the Brownie camera. They developed the Kodachrome color film to broaden further the reach of photography. And it's also worthwhile to notice that Kodak was the first company to develop a digital camera in 1975. So clearly a company founded on this idea of innovation. Now, on the other side of the ring, we have Fujifilm, of course. And there the story begins a little bit later in 1934, I guess in many ways brought on by Kodak, the generalization of access to photography. A man named Shojiro Asai founds a company called Fuji Photo Film in 1934 in Tokyo. And again, this is a company that is very innovative. They start with photographic film, they expand into medical X-ray films by 1936. They diversify quite a lot in post-World War II. They do optics, medical equipment, digital imaging. Again, a company that innovated through the decades, launching very notable products like the Fujica camera in the 60s and the first digital X-ray and full digital camera in the 80s. So both really great giants. You know, the Godzilla King Kong metaphor really applies here. Now let's talk about the hero of our story. The hero of our story is a man named Komori. He was born in 1939, so a couple of years after Fujifilm was founded, and he graduated in 1963. And right out of college, he joined Fujifilm. He worked his way up the corporate ladder, like many of us do, and ultimately, in 1996, he was appointed as a managing director. But just 1 year before becoming the managing director, he was given a special assignment by his predecessor. The assignment was to investigate the impact of digitalization and how it could affect the business and the technology. And he's quoted as saying, "I couldn't help but feel that special assignment had been a kind of message." And we know that it was a message because we just saw in 2000, film sales had peaked worldwide. And as he was going to become CEO in 2003, he remembers thinking that a peak always conceals a treacherous valley. And Komori really inherited a company at a crossroads in a complex environment where it was difficult to predict just how fast the market was going to shrink. Of course, everybody knew, including Kodak, that the market was going to change. Everybody understood that technology was going to have a huge impact, but they couldn't tell how fast it was going to happen. First, the market shrank slowly, and then it began picking up speed, and it declined, a market that was declining at the rate of 20 to 30% per year. In 2010, worldwide demand for film was less than 10% of what it had been 10 years prior. Now, everybody knew that their companies needed a radical transformation, and Komori was at the forefront of this. But what I want to talk about today is how he didn't just rely on what we would all typically, see companies do in these circumstances, which is cost-cutting measures. Instead, he envisioned a complete overhaul of Fujifilm's business model. In 2004, he unveiled something called Vision 75, a 6-year strategic plan named in honor of Fujifilm's 75th anniversary. And it has a clear goal for the company, that they will reach 2 to 3 trillion yen of revenue, which is somewhere between 16 and 26 billion US dollars. He understood that this was a company worthwhile preserving, that the world around him was changing faster than he could predict. And while he didn't necessarily know what the future held, what he knew for a fact was that he needed to create a company that would survive, that would continue to mean something to society and to the lives of, as you see, more than 70,000 employees worldwide and their families, and a company that could also adjust to any future, if we remember the definition of resilience. And so what did this vision bring about in terms of strategy? Well, there's something very beautiful that Komori did. I always, when I teach this case, I say, can you imagine that Fujifilm not only survived, but that it became a cosmetics company? Now, of course, that's a bit of an exaggeration because that's not where it makes most of its revenue today. But I think it's a really big statement, and it gets people to pause for a second to say, what do you mean? Why would they do cosmetics? And the reason they did this is because on a strategy level, Komori's genius was in saying, rather than worry about which market I'm in, the film market, I'm going to worry about what my company is uniquely capable of doing. And when he looked inward, he realized that actually, what do you need to be in order to be great at developing film? you need to have great knowledge in chemistry. I'm oversimplifying here, but hear me out. And he realized that Fujifilm had some crazy differentiated capability, and that he could take these capabilities and turn them into something new. Now, of course, they'd already dabbled in digital X-ray, as we saw earlier, and healthcare imaging and so on. But truthfully, most of their revenues were coming from the photographic industry. So what did he think? He's like, wait, first of all, actually, there is similarity between photographic film and other industries. Let's start with healthcare. You have to be really good at managing collagen and being able to stabilize it when you're doing film. It's one of the key ingredients of photographic films. And what do we know collagen is a big part of today? The skincare market. So he used that capability, and this allowed Fujifilm to enter the cosmetic and skincare market in 2007 in Japan with a line called Astralift, which ultimately they expanded into China and Europe later. That's one example. Another example was, again, incredible foresight. The company reflected on the potential rise of LCD screens, and they made a lot of investments in this area. And again, leveraged their expertise in photofilm industries and developed something called Fujitac, which is a high-performance film that is very specific to manufacturing LCD panels, TVs, computers, even smartphones. And currently, fast forward, they hold 70% of the market for these LCD polarizer films. That's pretty incredible. And then Fujifilm really solidified their entry into the healthcare industry, this time through strategic acquisitions. So of course, they already had a foot in it, but in order to be able to go much faster, they acquired companies like Toyama Chemical for $1.5 billion in 2008, Sonosite, Hitachi Diagnostics Imaging, and so on and so forth, transforming their healthcare division into actually its largest segments. And we'll look at their revenue in just a little bit and see how that was really has become one of their biggest revenue makers. So what was really beautiful about his approach from a strategic perspective wasn't that I don't think he predicted the rise of LCD screens with much certainty. But here's what he knew for sure. He knew for sure that the market that they were currently in was going to shrink. Maybe didn't know how fast, but he knew it was going to happen. He knew he had to provide alternatives for the company. And instead of placing all of his chips on one bet, he actually did what I call expanding the net, which is looking inwards, identifying his capabilities, understanding which markets were about to develop, and then using those capabilities to create opportunities to catch value in all of these markets. What was Kodak doing in the same time? Well, I'm going to use a quote from Kodak executives. They said, if someone's house catches fire, the first thing they rescue is their photographs. They believed that the sentimental value of physical photos would protect their market. Essentially, they were in denial. They continued pouring resources into the film business and underinvested in other future solutions. They became victims of their own success in some way, and they weren't able to see past what had worked in the past. One of their CTOs later said, it seems Kodak had developed antibodies against anything that might compete with film. And of course, we know what ended up happening. Digital photography took off. Kodak, of course, attempted diversification. They spent north of $10 billion on this problem, but it was too little, too late, so to speak. And so let's pause here for a second and reflect on what really surprised us in Kimori's approach to strategy about this widening of the net. And let me offer you perhaps a couple of frameworks that can help to explain what he was doing, or maybe help you to reflect if you and your organization are doing that too. And here I have to say a great big thank you to Mihai Ionescu, who's an incredible strategy technician, as he likes to call himself, and who taught me about all of these things. So the first thing that Kimori was doing was that he was looking at various horizons, right? Horizon 1 is your current competitive advantage. In that case, it would have been the film industry and their film products. But in parallel, he was also considering what would be the source of their next and their future competitive advantage. He was having 3 horizons thinking. This is a framework developed by McKinsey, if I'm not making this up. And I think like a great point of reflection for leaders about whether their companies are ready for the future is whether or not they are developing projects, ideas, services that match their theory about what each of the horizons hold. And a good way to see that with Fujifilm's revenue in terms of Horizon 1, 2, and 3 thinking is how their revenues actually developed over time. And so what we can see is that if you look in the early 2000s, imaging solutions, so where the photography piece would sit, as well as business innovation and document solutions, those were Horizon 1 for them at that time, meaning they were the source of competitive advantage, revenue, etc. And as time goes by, they kind of start to shrink, particularly the imaging, pure Fujifilm piece. And what happens is these other bets, so to speak, start to gain more ground, whether on the material side or, as we'll see now, on healthcare, which is now about 34% of their revenue. So I like to use a metaphor, which I'll share with you shortly, in terms of like their horses. But a good way to know if, as a leader, you have different initiatives in your companies that match each of these horizons is that you have projects that are in each of these zones. And so again, this is the Zone to Win framework. The name escapes me now, but I'll Google it because this is the internet. I can do this while talking to you. So Geoffrey Moore is the person who authored this. And it's a match to the 3 horizons, which is to say, well, how do we know what kind of business models or products or services or offerings we are developing internally that match each of these horizons? And so the idea as a leader, and I do this a lot in my own company, is to make sure that at any given time, we are not just focusing on the Horizon 1 stuff. That's the stuff that has high productivity, high performance, that we sell a lot of, that have good margins, that we've perfected. But it's also to ensure that we have other business models, other products that are in Horizon 2 and Horizon 3, meaning they're either in pure incubation, they don't make any money, you're just investing on them because you think they're a good bet. They're starting to be in transformation, meaning you can start to see, beyond the noise, that there is a signal that shows you that there is demand for this, it's going to grow, we have the capability to develop it. And you're moving your ideas through these various zones and through the horizons. And a metaphor that I really like to use here that has worked a lot for me and my team is this idea of horses. So if you are in the business of competing in horse races, you know very well that while you might have a generation of horses that is well-trained, high-performing, that is currently competing, if you don't train your next generation of horses, you will stop being in the races soon. And so I think that's a very simple metaphor that allows us to understand whether or not we are reflecting, through that perspective of the various horizons. Having spoken now about strategy, let's talk about structure, because of course, that's the second direct element, which is what happens when we update our strategy. We need a structure that's going to live up to it. Now, how does Polarities show up in this space? Let's talk about that. The idea here is that we need to build organizations that are able to do what Fujifilm did, which is to continue exploring our current business model. So if we're still selling film, we're not going to drop it. We're going to continue doing it. We're going to continue milking the cow until it is no longer an option. But we also have to set up organizations that can explore the future, right? So we exploit the current competitive advantage and we explore the future. And that's a really hard thing to do. When we talk about polarities, especially at the organizational level, it's very difficult to be able within a single unit, within a single team, to do both of those things. Now, the nice thing is that we have academics and researchers who have already helped us to understand the types of structures that are able to do both of those things. This is taken from their article. It's Charles O'Reilly Ambidextrous Organization, where they refer to the Roman god Janus, who had 2 sets of eyes, one focusing on the past and one on the future. And so the question that they raised is, what is the ideal organizational structure for having organizations that can do both the present and the future? Because that's what Kimori was requiring from his organization. So let's talk a little bit about how he structured Fujifilm at that time. He understood this intuitively, that in order to build for the future, he needed a structure that could both explore and exploit. So what did he do? Fujifilm Corporation, that's the one in light blue over here, that's the unit that would manage the core film business, focusing on incremental improvements, small efficiencies. And the other two units would explore healthcare, cosmetics, other sectors. And the first thing he did was separate these units from one another. So one of the key elements of what we call ambidextrous organizations, those companies that can do both of those things, is A, they separate the units that explore from the units that exploit. That's number one. Number two, they still keep them within the same reporting structure, meaning there's integration at the top. What we often see, we've seen a lot of companies make these mistakes, is they understand that they need to set up a separate innovation lab over here. That's usually what they call it. But there's no good path to integration. And so the people who are working on the innovation side of the business don't really have any good means of bringing their findings back into the core business. And Komori knew this instinctively, because I think he did this before this research came out, if I'm not mistaken. But at the same time, integrating through the leadership and also integrating through sharing research and development capabilities. So he centralized their R&D because he knew that innovation was essential to Fujifilm's survival. He put all of the R&D people together, moved them to a newly built facility, and made sure that there was communication and innovation and collaboration across all of the engineers, regardless of which business unit they were serving. And he did something which we now all consider to be quite typical, which is that he brought all of the shared services under the same umbrella as well. So PR, corporate planning, HR, all of that stuff, to ensure that resources would flow seamlessly across the group. And it also enabled this dynamic exchange of ideas, technology, etc. And we'll see that in just a minute. He coupled the structural change with a culture change, which we'll talk about, in order to make sure that the spirit of collaboration and innovation was strong. Now, in parallel, what did Kodak's structure look like? Well, they stuck to their conventional organizational structure of functional divisions. Again, not uncommon. Sales and marketing, R&D, production, everybody operating in silo, functioning independently with their own global teams. And if Kodak was to try and save itself, this structure was one of the most significant obstacles in being able to achieve alignment, coordinating company-wide initiatives. Each manager was really primarily concerned with safeguarding their own domain, and communication and collaboration didn't happen. And so whether he realized it or not, Komori was building an ambidextrous organization. And these are organizations that have structurally independent units, as we said, with their own culture, their own structure, their own processes, but are integrated into existing management hierarchies, and where we really think mindfully about how they integrate and how the work of both come together, but we give them the space to operate in different ways, because one is exploiting a very well-known industry, a very well-known business model, working on small performance optimizations, and the other is trying to build the future. And in the research of Charles O'Reilly, they found that 90% of ambidextrous organizations achieve their goals, including their innovation goals, when they maintain this act of separation and integration. Whereas if we look at Kodak's structure, which was a functional one, only 25% of those reach those goals. So it's a clear indication that in scaling polarities, this concept into organizations, this idea of exploring and exploiting needs to show up at all levels of the system, including within the structure. But that also brings us to the fact that changing the structure never works on its own. We've seen this happen a million times. We announce a new strategy, we change the structure, and then we kind of leave it there and things don't really work out. And the truth is that exploitative businesses and exploratory businesses don't really require the same mindset. That's why you separate them, because you want their culture, their processes, etc., to be distinct. You don't want them contaminating each other. But if you just separate them and you don't create a culture of integration, typically these things just fail. Why? Because on the one side, if you're in an exploitative business, You need to be, concerned with cost and profit. Like we said, you're doing incremental innovation, small optimizations, you're focused on efficiencies and operations and so on. You're looking at things like margins, productivity, right? That's what you're focused on. On the other hand, exploratory businesses need to innovate, they need to grow, they need to be agile and adaptive. They're probably working on more breakthrough innovation. They have an entrepreneurial mindset. And what often happens when you have those two units, if we don't work on how to culturally integrate them, is that in the exploratory business, typically people are often, although I don't want to be ageist, are a bit younger. And they look at the other guys and girls and they say, wow, like these guys are bureaucrats, they're slow, they have no idea what the future holds, they're living in the past. And on the other hand, the exploitative business, they're looking at the entrepreneurial people over there and thinking, these kids, they're spending all the money, we're the ones providing them with the money and the resources, they're wasteful, they haven't generated revenue yet, and so on and so forth. And that's why it's so important to couple the structural change with a cultural one. Because, of course, we all know culture eats strategy for lunch and eats structure for lunch. And that's why, Komori from the very beginning was very conscious of that and knew that his Vision 75 plan needed to be accompanied by a culture that was now good at integrating the competing needs of the present and the future. What did he do? By the way, he did some very boring, simple things, but we do culture change projects all the time. And I can tell you, it is these basics that most companies just don't get right, because you have to be both disciplined and daring in order to do that. So he knew that his employees would need freedom to experiment and discipline to deliver. Freedom to experiment and the discipline to deliver on very, very high standards. He promoted values like courage, rational decision-making, an unwavering pursuit of innovative technologies through collaboration at its center stage. Employees were encouraged to innovate, test new ideas, but within a framework that demanded excellence. And of course, how do you bring excellence in a company's measurable performance and results, right? So he knew that he needed to balance this entrepreneurial culture with an emphasis on performance and results, and to do both at the same time. So in order to drive the implementation of Vision 75, he introduced performance management systems, emphasizing accountability and results. Kodak, on the other hand, they had what many would then qualify as a culture of complacency. They said that they wanted to prioritize innovation, but actually their internal systems punished failure. Their culture was rooted in the security of the past successes, and they didn't really foster risk-taking approach. They'd been so used to generating profit, they were victims of their own success. And again, this wasn't accomplished through some crazy idea we've never heard of. It's just that how we drove the culture, the L&D programs that were put in place to teach the Fujifilm way and how you lead here and how you manage here, to teach leaders to be, focused on both the performance side and the innovation side. The performance measurement measures that they put in place, nothing groundbreaking. Now, remember, this was 20 years ago, but even today, we see so many companies failing at being able to build these innovative cultures that are masters of paradox. And so this is based on the work of Gary Pisano that looks at cultures of innovation. And what we find is that innovative cultures are masters of paradox. Again, paradox, polarity. In which way? Well, like Komori's Fujifilm, they have a very high tolerance for failure, but no tolerance for incompetence. It's okay to fail because you tried something, because you took a risk. It's certainly not okay to fail because you're not trying to be good at your job. You have to be willing to experiment, but in order to scale experiments into a real solution, you have to have incredibly high discipline. You have to have high standards. You have to seek excellence. They create spaces for psychological safety, and they are brutally candid in their feedback because they know that those two things work hand in hand. And while collaboration is central to innovation, so is individual accountability. And that's the other way in which this concept of polarity scales into organizations. because it actually tells us that we have to build companies and cultures that are able to sustain both of those ways of being. And every single individual in that company or our organization needs to be able to navigate the spectrum and to be on both sides of it. And in that sense, I think one of, for me, of the great lessons of how you're able to get your organization to master polarities is that you need to both get the beautiful basics right and the big bets right. A lot of Komori's decisions are just prudent, well thought out steps. They're in the playbook of every transformation guide you'll ever find, but they were well implemented. And others, like expanding into cosmetics, may appear as reckless because they were big bets. And in that sense, he was an ambidextrous leader. He was able to bring in both dimensions of exploration and exploitation to focus on, what we talked about earlier, growth and profitability, innovation and excellence. And I think one of the things that really resonates with me about his story is something that he later said, actually, in his book, Innovating Out of Crisis. So he says that number one leaders use a sword of steel, whereas number two leaders use a bamboo sword. And what he means by that is that number one leaders understand that if they lose, they die. They come to work every day with this idea that they can't afford to be wrong. Now, of course, that doesn't mean they can't afford to be wrong on every single decision. They can't afford to be wrong on the big vision that they're setting. And Komori, confessed that he's had many sleepless nights during this transformation. And what really comes out there is that to be an ambidextrous leader, to be the kind of leader that can do both of those things, you have to have courage, you have to have decisiveness, you have to be bold. And that is all on the shoulder of a leader. And it's really a testament of the power of daring leadership and strategic foresight. And so to summarize, what we're saying is that organizations that master polarities have a strategy that cuts across horizons, our three horizons that we saw. They have a structure that is ambidextrous, and to support that structure, they have a culture that is a master of paradox. But none of this can happen without an original leader or a group of leaders that develop their courage and their range and are able to then teach their organization how to scale this into an actual capability. And for all of those of you who have been coming to our sessions and listening to us and following this conference, I know you all have courage and range, and you're all curious because you wouldn't otherwise be spending time listening to us talk about polarities. And I hope that some of the frameworks that we've shared here with you today will help you to expand this curiosity, this courage, this willingness to explore your range into your organizations. An invitation that actually my teacher, Joe Santos, which will be joining me later today, has always given me at the end of every talk or session that he was giving, was to take a second to think about what is the most important thing you learned today, how you'll implement it, how you want to bring that to your organization. And the way he used to ask this is, how will you remember it in 20 years? Thank you all for joining us today. This video will be available on our social, YouTube, and website. I will take a minute to answer some of the questions that have been asked to me by the audience before I close us off. So let me go through them now. All right, let's see. What would you recommend leaders do if they want to be like Komori and consider how their organizations can create value in new ways based on the resources and capabilities they have? Honestly, I only have one big piece of advice to answer this question. I think through our conference, we've shared a lot of insights and tools and frameworks today, a lot of inspiration from academics, from coaches, and from leaders themselves. I think the only thing I can say here is that you need to have intentionality. So you've listened to some of this conference, you're curious, you want to try and bring that in. You have to carve out time. You have to be intentional. You have to do this meaningfully. Bring in the people around you and do a little bit of work around it every day. That's a simple, advice that I can give to leader. Be intentional, be relentless, and be a little bit stubborn, I think. Another question, impossible to answer this one. What's a healthy number of Horizon 3 products? I can't possibly tell you. I don't think it works that way. I think it really depends on the size of your company, the size of the bet that you're making. It's however many you think is healthy, but knowing that it's a funnel, right? And that a lot of the stuff you start developing in Horizon 3 won't make it. I'll say for sure more than however many is in Horizon 2 and however many is in Horizon 1. Maybe let's look at it that way. Right. So having done implementations across 3 pillars of strategy, structure, and culture, which of these do you find most challenging to align within an organization? Oh, that's the question. Look, I'll honestly say it is culture. And the reason I'll say that is that there's a lot on strategy and structure. And also, I always say this, I think strategy and structure can fit on a slide. And that's why people find them easier to grasp, because you can explain them on a PowerPoint deck. But culture is a series of really small nudges. It is not, you can't just announce it like a structure and then it's there, right? When you announce a structure, people's reporting line changes, it's done. Of course, informal networks are still there, but it's done. Culture is the opposite. Actually, the second you announce it is the beginning of the journey. And what I find is that a lot of organizations aren't disciplined enough, in having their leaders be intentional about it, providing them with personal coaching and collective coaching on how to represent that culture. They don't have the level of discipline to be relentless about it, to continuously provide feedback to each other as a leadership or management team. And then most organizations also don't take, whatever their values, their purpose, whatever it may be, and turn them into systemic elements by integrating them into things like performance management, recruitment, onboarding, internal comms, policies. They end up having this little culture thing over here on the side and never really do the work to make sure that culture now seeps into every element of how they behave every day. So that's why I think it's culture. And then one last question here. How does the company's size or growth stage impact building on ambidextrous org? Startup versus more established. I mean, the Fujifilm example, this was a company with 70,000 employees. So I don't think that the bigger you get, the harder it is. Maybe the opposite, in fact. If you think of us as Cosmic Centers within our own team, we're so small. Who's going to just focus on the future and focus on the present? We end up having single individuals who have to do both. I find that actually the fewer resources you have, in some ways, the harder it is to create that separation in functions and that exploration piece. But for many startups, they are in exploration mode. They're not yet in exploitation mode. So they maybe only have to be on one side of it. So I do think that, the bigger it is, in some ways, the easier. It might seem harder because there's more people to convince and switch, but it's also that you have more resources and more slack, that you can get more of those bets wrong. Thank you all for those really, really great questions. And with that, I will wrap us up. If you enjoyed, by the way, the stories of Fujifilm and Kodak, I should mention that we have 2 full episodes of our podcast, Center Stage, that cover each of these stories independently in even more depth. Before I close off, we also have one last session to wrap up this year's conference, which is happening later today at 6 p.m. Join us for that session with the one and only Joe Santos, who has joined us for every single closing of every single Cosmic conference. And together we'll actually be unpacking the limitations of polarities, looking at where this framework or this model no longer applies or may be harmful, right here on LinkedIn Live later at 6 p.m. today. And then lastly, before leaving you, I will leave you with my favorite quote of the conference by Niels Bohr, who's a Nobel Prize-winning scientist. And he says, "How wonderful that we have met with a paradox. Now we have some progress. Now we have some hope of making progress." So let me say that again. How wonderful that we've met with a paradox. Now we have some hope of making progress. And I hope that the conference has been a moment to inspire you as individuals and leaders to start to see paradox as a source of potential value creation as opposed to as a problem to deal with. I hope to see you later today. Goodbye.